Hello and welcome to another episode of Sandy Killer Projects. Today we're going to be doing another job that I wasn't hoping to be doing anytime soon. This is on the KL Cherokee that we have. The oil cooler seems to have gone bad. Either the O-rings have gone bad or the housing is cracked. I got the diagnosis from how to do this or why this happens basically from a bunch of internet videos and chasing down what my issue is. I have oil in between the rear head and the front head in the valley. It pools up and then rolls off of the driver's side of the engine down onto the transmission and then causes a small leak. This has been something that's been very, very small. After I did the last oil change, I noticed more oil, but not a significant amount more than prior to having done the oil change. It's entirely possible that the housing for the oil cooler is cracked. The oil cooler is actually part of this, which is part of your oil filter housing. So the housing goes down and then the cooler sits underneath the intake right in this area right here. So unfortunately, to do this, it's going to look very similar to how we did the plug video. We're going to end up disassembling all of this rear area, the hose, the airbox, the intake, to get down into the space in between the two heads to get to the oil cooler. So before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. All right, so looking at this from the top of the engine, the first part we're going to remove is the air line from the airbox over to the side. It's just a flathead screwdriver on each side. There's a little push connector that goes in here that attaches a radiator overflow line. It pops right off. That's this guy right here. Next thing we're going to do is start moving the parts around this to get it off. There should be a clip on this that makes this to where it would stay in. I broke mine when we did the spark plug, so it's just zip tied in place. This is actually going to stay here. If you need to take it off of this to manipulate it, the easiest way to do that is to lift it off of this and take this connector off of this seat right here. That'll give you access to this. This guy, you lift up. If you put too much pressure on it, it will break. These little connector locks are really, really cheaply made. The easiest way to get them to come loose is to get a small screwdriver underneath the bottom and work either side of the connector away from the opening until it pops up. Once it gets to where it is approximately that high, the tube fitting that's on the bottom of this will slide right out of it, which is this guy down here. So once that's out of the way, you need to get this connector off. You can push down on the back of it. Same thing though, a lot of times it's easier to lift this front edge of the connector. It helps because pushing on it, these are all plastic, they're likely to break. So we'll put a little pressure and then lift there. This comes off of this top for this air sensor. So that will get this part free. Next, there's a connector on the back here for the back of the airbox. Once that's loose, there are some bolts, some mounts I should say, that seat this into the top of the air intake. Again, on mine, we broke them taking them off. So mine will just be removing the sensor and loosening the flathead for the clamp, and then wiggling these out of the fittings that they're just sitting underneath. All right, so to remove the airbox, you undo the bolt as I mentioned, you undo the connector for the plug. My mounts are already broken on it. The only other thing is you got to get the connector for the air sensor. Has a push connect mount that goes through the side of it. This one finally gave up after pulling it off for the second time. So there's almost nothing holding that box on now, except for the clamps. So next we have to work on getting the intake off. There are a lot of parts to it, a handful of connectors. We'll do those and then I'll walk through that. Right, so for removing parts on the on the intake, there's an air line that connects to this mount right here. It just pushes back. Sometimes this thing sticks. You can get a little screwdriver in there and work it loose. Same thing with this. This goes into the back of the intake right before the throttle body, just above this sensor. There are two more sensors. This one has a little red tab. Push it back, lift up the front, pull it out. There's another one that goes onto the throttle position sensor for the throttle body. It's the same thing. It's a little red clip. You can push it back and then lift it up and it pops out. There are two clips that attach on. They're just to keep the wire loom in place. You just lift them off and they come loose. There's one other line in the front that connects to the side of your airbox. When I took this off last time, it broke the little clip. It's the same style clip that's on this one that connects to this fitting. I have this held on in place with tape. I put these down in there and then wrap them with electrical tape, and it keeps everything held where it's supposed to be. So that's all the parts that have to come off of the air intake. Now we have to start disassembling the intake. Okay, there are four 10mm bolts that have to come off. First two are right here. They're on two brackets that hold this down and in place. In the back, there's one here and there's one here. This also is on a bracket that holds this all into place. The next, there are 7 bolts that hold the intake in place onto the manifold itself. So these 7 bolts back out but don't come completely out. The reason why there isn't 8 is because the 8th one would be in this position and there's a bracket right here. So there's no bolt in this position. It's in every other position. That loosens everything up. You still can't get this off. There's one other thing that still has to be done. On the back bracket where those two 10mm go, there's one bolt that holds it in place, but it sits on this wire loom mount. So you need to get a 14 in here and pry it to get the wire loom mount to walk away, and then loosen the bolt that's in behind it. Once you do that, this bracket can tip down and then you can pick the intake up and out. Now that the intake is off, you can see the bracket that holds the back 2 bolts in place. It also is attached to this wiring harness for all the intake parts that we've already looked at. There's a 13mm bolt inside of that mount for the wire harness. You loosen that off until it allows you to wiggle this thing far enough back and away that you can take the intake up and out. That in my case, it's still on. The stud is still just barely hanging on. You can actually kind of see it down in there, right there, that it's wiggling on. That is the mount for it. You can back it all the way off. It actually is a little bit easier to get everything in and out with it all the way off, but it's harder to get the stud back into place. So now that the intake's off, there's also this rubber boot that allows the intake to sit on. You just take this guy off and set it aside. Also, if we were doing the spark plugs, this would be the point where we'd be at the spark plugs for both sides. But we need to take this guy off because the part that we need is sitting just underneath here. At this point, there are 8 of these bolts, 4 on the front that hold the lower part of the intake in place. These are your fuel rails. Everything is held down by stuff. So we're at the point where there's a decision that's got to be made as to what's going to be moved, what's going to be set. These 8 bolts are off. This whole assembly is loose, but I need it to pick up and move out of the way. So it's possible that I could disconnect the fuel line, but that's not going to give me enough because there's connectors on either side all the way down. So these bolts, these 8 bolts, they're 8mm, or they take a little tiny Torx, which I wouldn't even try to get a Torx down into that. So once you get those 8 bolts off, you have to decide what's going to come loose to let it get out of your way. Okay, so what I decided was the easiest way to get this off was I don't want to get into the fuel. So this is your fuel connection, and there's a little line that takes it over to the other half. The easiest way to do it is there are two of these push connectors, one on the top of the plate here and one further down that holds onto this bigger wire loom that's over there. Pop those off of it because they're keeping the front end from moving. Then the next thing that you need to do is take off all 6 of the injector plugs. To undo the injector plugs, you have to pop this up. A lot of times these break. I actually only ended up breaking one. I ended up breaking this one, but it still ended up coming up enough that I could get it loose. Then once you do that, there's a little piece right here that you push. That makes this piece of the plug move away from the clip that's on this side. So while pushing this, you have to wiggle the plug up and out. Be careful with the wires can get brittle and they can break really easy. Once you have all 6 of those out, the 2 of those, and you've already taken out your 8mm bolts, all 8 of those, this guy wiggles out of this space, and I'm just going to set it off to the side. Okay, the lower intake is out. You can see there's a bunch of oil down into the valley in there, in an area where we don't want it. It's because this piece, this entire assembly, is full of O-rings. All the parts for the O-rings cause leaks. There are 4 on the bottom that are the main culprits that are known to leak. You can also have this be the cause of your leak. It could crack from being over tightened, but this entire assembly that's sitting in the valley here needs to come out. Before I do that, I need to clean up a bunch of this stuff because I don't want any of that dirt getting into the intake, and I want it all nice and clean before it goes back down. Also, on the back side of the intake, there are these 6 O-rings that seat down onto the face of the block there. We want to make sure, or actually onto each side of the head, we want to make sure that these are all in good shape and not crushed or messed up. So this all needs to get cleaned up. All right, on the oil cooler, there are 2 different sensors. One's your oil pressure, one's your oil temperature. They have clips that have to be pulled back and then lifted off as well. The top one is here, the bottom is here. Underneath that, there's a coolant line that comes through and actually does the cooling of your oil as it's circulating through. That's going to have to get taken loose after you get your electrical connectors off, and then there are 5 bolts, 2 here, 2 here, and there's 1 in the back here. These are E-style torque. I don't have the sizes just yet. That will remove the whole thing off. Okay, so getting a good look down into that valley there. Here are the 2 screws in the back. The other 2 screws are right here. There's one behind the filter housing on this side. They are E8 reverse torques, I guess is what you would consider it, was the torques. There are the 2 plugs. I've already taken those and moved those out of the way. Everything is basically loose. The one thing that I will mention that I'm doing that you may not want to, there is a hold down for the water line right here that goes down into the block with a push connector. You can get the push connector out. It's down below the hose, so it's in a difficult position. There's also a holder right here. So since there's already a holder right here, the only purpose of this is to make sure that it doesn't interact with the lower section of the intake, and it's so far down it won't. So I actually have taken apart this push connector so that I can get the hose to back off and come out. So this is going to be the last piece I'm going to take off because water will come out of this and it will fill the valley with watery oil. So that will be the last thing that I disconnect before I remove this piece out of there, and then I have to clean all down inside of the valley to make sure that there's no leftover oil or junk hanging out in there. Before I take the water line off, the one thing I want to note is the smartest thing to do is to either pinch it or disconnect it from the backside and let the water pour out if you're going to do it that way. Then disconnect the clamp down in here. So the new one has just arrived, and this is the new unit here. It comes with everything already installed. It has your oil filter in it, and the two sensors out on the end that need to get replugged back in. And all the hardware, everything is ready to go. You literally just connect it in, and it's ready to install. All right, so the part number that I have is 68310-865AF-001. This is the Mopar direct replacement for this. Okay, so once you have the old one out, you need to clean up all the oil and water that is settled down into the space in here. Clean it all up really good, because this is going to now become your mating surfaces for your O-rings, and you don't want any of this stuff to leak. So clean all the fluid, any debris around the O-ring openings, anything that's going to cause an issue with causing this to seat properly. Okay, before we move on to installing, I'm just showing you, this is how clean it all needs to be. These two jackets right here, the one my finger's at and the one my finger's at now, both of those have water in them. They're supposed to. If you try to soak it out, you won't, because it goes into the water jacket for the engine. At this point, we'll start reinstalling. Everything goes back in just like it came out. The hose, the connectors, the bolts, that'll seat it down into position. Also make sure there's an O-ring right here. That one goes down into for the oil filter. Make sure that you are careful as you set that one down and don't drop any of those three or that big black one on the back as you're setting them. They're made to stay in position, but just be careful as you install. All right, so now that it's in, notice I still have the clamp on the water line. There's a reason for that. The water will start flowing back into it. Make sure it's all the way bolted down before you decide to put that back on, or take this clamp off, I mean. Okay, now that I'm installing the lower intake, there's something I want to note before we go too far. The 5 bolts that mount this down, the 8 bolts that mount the lower intake down, don't crank down hard all the bolts. Crank them down, yes, snug them up, call it a day. If you crank any of this stuff too hard, it's all made out of plastic, it'll shatter, and then you'll have a cracked lower intake, upper intake, the part you just replaced, the oil cooler. So just, as you can see, I'm just going to snug and a little past, and then kind of double checking them. I absolutely do not want to crank down on any of this stuff. So just for show, I'm putting on the last injector plug. These go on really easy. They just make a click like it just did, and then you push down the red tab. That's it, and they're installed. Make sure you get all 6 of those, and the 2 clips that hold the wire looms in place. They're push connectors, and then your lower intake set. Okay, setting the upper section of the intake, you have your 7 8mm bolts that go into the top. Make sure that you seat it into the 2 front brackets. Now, this is the one thing I wanted to show. This bracket in the back is always a pain to get on and off. The reason why is it never sits quite where you want it to go until it's in its home position. So the one change I've made, especially since I've now been in here twice, is I've actually put a relief cut into the top of this bracket. Once it's all the way home and set, it's where it needs to go, but it fights going in and out. I've spent most of an hour today fighting with it until I decided it made more sense to actually open this top edge up. So make sure you set your 13 down here that's on behind this wire loom, and then put your 2, I believe they're 10s, back on these, and then the 2 10s on the front. All right, once your upper intake is on and set, all your bolts and hardware is in, start working the little clips back in that go around for the mounts for your air sensors, and then start reconnecting all of your sensors. Also, on the front, there is a tube right here. There are 2 clips on it, and then it connects into the side of the airbox. Make sure you hook that back up also. So all of this stuff goes fairly quick from this point. It's all just installing stuff. This goes onto the boot. This goes onto the sensors in the back. So next we'll put the box and the tube, and we'll be almost done. Alright, so with your airbox set in the back, tighten the screw, put your air sensor back in, put your wire loom back in place. This hose goes on this guy right here, and then your little horseshoe clip goes down and locks it in place. This push connector goes in there. Air boot goes on here. This little rubber opening here is for push connector on this. That'll install that in place. Okay, once all your connectors are back on your hoses, the next thing you're going to want to do is start the car up and run it. Before you do that, make sure you have water. It's really difficult to check the amount of oil that you lost before you started it up. This is going to hold about a half quart of oil. So start it, run it, check your oil level on your dipstick, and then add oil as needed. So the other thing is, once you fire this all up, you need to get a bright flashlight and check down in here and see if oil is starting to pool up again. If it is, then you didn't do something right with this. Other than that, that's what it takes to do this. Thanks for watching. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps out our channel.